My name is Eliza June Mercer. I'm 33 years old, and I live in Seattle in a small apartment above a bakery that smells like cinnamon at dawn. I work night shifts at a hospital. Intubations, IVs, the quiet, terrifying gravity of people who aren't sure they'll see morning. Lately my life has been a string of exhausted commutes, a few clean shirts, and the way my son Jonah presses his face into my back like he's trying to memorize my shoulder. Emotionally it's been a canyon, a past that keeps echoing, and a present I hold together with duct tape and will. I am tense and strangely hopeful in the same breath. Hope now feels like a borrowed coat on a rainy day. Before I dive in, this is hard to say out loud, I should ask. If you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. I don't tell this easily, but maybe someone else needs to know they're not alone. The ticket in my pocket felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. I had bought it with the last portion of savings after 3 sleepless nights and 1 furious phone call. I was flying back to Columbus, the town I'd spent my childhood running from, to meet a judge and a line of papers stamped with ink that I hoped meant safety. To most people it would read like bureaucracy. To me it read like survival. The truth is, by the time I bought the ticket, I had been running my whole life. Running from my mother's voice, my brother's glare, the small-town church that smiled too wide around people who didn't deserve forgiveness. I grew up in a house with curtains that never seemed to fully close, where secrets were like dinnerware stacked on top of one another. Clink, clink, always in motion. My mother, Mara, loved us in ways that looked like control. She kept our schedules, our visitors, even our opinions neat and folded. My brother, Adam, learned early to be the gatekeeper. He was the one who answered the door when I tried to slip out at 16, the one who told me later that I was making everything harder than it needed to be. They both had their version of love, which was to say, their version of what I was allowed to be. When Jonah was 2, something changed. I'd been living back home for a while. Money had run out, so had patience, and the quiet suffocated me. There were injuries the way there were old creaks in the house that never got fixed. Apologies that smelled like business as usual. I remember the night I found him on the back steps, small hands trembling, saying, "He's been in my room." The way my stomach turned that night is a thing I can still feel in my teeth. My mother called it a misunderstanding. My brother said, "We can handle this without making it worse." And they both made me stand in the kitchen while they argued that keeping everything quiet was better for us than breaking the family. I didn't believe them. I couldn't hand Jonah back into that air. It was a terrible, soft, foolish thing. Pulling him into my car at 2 a.m., driving away without a plan beyond a rusted map of how to get north until the skyline of another city became something like sanctuary. There were nights on couches that didn't belong to us, rides in cars that smelled like fast food and fear, a suffocating grief I tried to dress as determination. And for 3 years I did what people who have nowhere else to go do. I built, quietly, with hands that shook with the memory of him being small and frightened. Then a letter. A lawyer's envelope that wasn't from my mother, from the county in Ohio, and a number to call. They said my mother had filed for temporary custody of Jonah, citing abandonment. They said I might have walked away and left him, that leaving had been a betrayal. When the words stabbed at me, it wasn't the possible loss of custody that ruined me. It was the idea I'd be stripped of the thing that made leaving legal and right, the protection I had wrung from doctors and social workers the year before. I needed proof, not only to a judge, but to a room full of people who had watched me and said I was being melodramatic. So I called a lawyer in Columbus. I sent the affidavits from the pediatrician, the notes from the therapist Jonah had been seeing after the incident, the photos of damage to his bedroom, the police report that had been filled out the night my hands shook so badly while I spoke with an officer I could barely remember. The attorney, her name was Dana, and she had a voice like a bell, worked all night, and by morning we had a stack of papers. An emergency temporary custody order, signed by a judge who had read the affidavits and understood, a directive that Jonah was to remain under my custody while the case proceeded, and crucially, a permission to travel clause. They stamped it with a county seal and wrote in a way that meant I could leave state lines for the purpose of presenting these findings to a specific child advocacy appointment. It wasn't everything, but it was armor. I packed Jonah's sneakers into a backpack, folded a change of clothes for myself, and put the papers in an inner pocket under my ribcage like a second heart. At the Seattle-Tacoma airport, the fluorescent lights were too bright, the floors too unforgiving, and my hands had the electric tremor of someone about to step off a cliff. Jonah clutched a small stuffed dog his grandmother had given him before I left the house the first time. It smelled faintly of detergent and something sweet I associated with safe mornings. I tried to breathe like the nurse I'd become. Slow, even. But the memory of my mother's hands was inside my chest like a fist. Around me the world moved on. Families yelling through phones, a man sleeping on a pile of luggage, the scent of coffee and burnt toast. My phone buzzed once, my brother. I didn't answer. I didn't want his voice to shape the moment I had fought so hard to make mine. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people, I said to myself out loud, an absurd little ritual that steadied me. It felt ridiculous and needed, like brushing my teeth before something awful. I had rehearsed words in hotel lobbies and in my head on night drives. I have the order, I would say. It's legal. But rehearsals don't prepare you for the way a room full of strangers suddenly leans in when the family you fled appears in the gate area like a weather front, serious and inevitable. I had no idea how loud silence could be until people stopped talking and watched. I learned, in the worst possible way, that small-town people travel. They carry the same faces into big glass buildings and sit in reclining chairs with the exact same expressions. And the moment they spot a person they've been trying to control, they disassemble their manners and become a force. My mother arrived first. Long linen coat, a scarf knotted with the practiced precision of a woman who never let herself be seen undressed by emotion, and my brother behind her, taller and meaner than I remembered. He wore the look of someone who'd been rehearsed in anger. They were not subtle. My mother's eyes were an invitation to be cornered. "Eliza," she called, voice even like someone turning a page. My knees turned to ice. Jonah pressed his forehead into my side, as if the tremor of my breath was contagious. I kept the papers in the inner pocket, fingers curled around them like a talisman. Adam stepped forward before I could, words clipped. "You don't get to just show up," he said. He was talking loud enough to pull a small crowd. A few heads turned. "You abandoned him. You can't take him on a whim. You threatened him," my mother added, a hand poised as if to swat him away from the conversation. "You left him in the house, Eliza. You left him where?" "Stop," I said. The word came out thinner than I meant. People scrolled their phones, curiosity like a live wire. On the other side of gate B17, a man with a business bag paused mid-sip of his latte and watched the triangle we'd made. Adam, the gatekeeper, reached for his phone. I knew what he intended. He would call someone to tell them there was a kidnapping, maybe even involve a lawyer to make me look small in public. He wanted witnesses, a crowd, bodies to corroborate the version of reality that made them the reasonable ones and me the irrational daughter. I counted to 3 and then stepped forward. "I have the order," I said. "I have the custody papers. I have the judge's signature. I have travel permission." My mother's face didn't flinch. She just smiled the way people smile when they're sure the moment will tip in their favor. "This is theater," she murmured. "I'm calling the police." She did. Adam did. I watched as the lines blurred between private pain and public performance. 2 phone calls, 2 different claims, 2 sets of stamps and names being hurled like grenades. The terminal seemed to tilt. The air tasted metallic. The officer who arrived looked like someone who had seen 100 family dramas and had long since learned how quickly facts get buried in personal history. He introduced himself. Officer Morales, neutral, careful. He asked for identification, for my name, for Jonah's birth certificate. My hands shook again while I fumbled in my bag for the proper documents, the pediatrician's affidavit, the signed custody order. Sweat pooled at the base of my neck. When I handed him the stack, I tried to keep my voice level. "This was issued at 8:12 this morning," I said. "Judge Reinhardt signed it after reviewing the affidavits. It explicitly permits travel for the purpose of this appointment and allows Jonah to stay with me pending a hearing." Officer Morales skimmed the pages in the yellowed light of the terminal. You could have heard a spoon drop. He looked at me through cheap aviator glasses and then across to my mother and brother. "Were you served with any notice?" he asked my mother. My mother's jaw tightened. "Not yet, but—" "Then these are legal documents, Ms. Mercer?" Morales turned back to me. "Yes." My voice cracked on the word, but I held the papers like a shield. There was a beat of silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning seemed obscene. People around us diverted their eyes, some out of lack of interest, others as if privacy had been violated in front of them. A toddler a few rows back stopped wailing. I felt Jonah's small warm hand slide into mine. Then Adam, who never listened except when he wanted an audience, made a move for the papers. "Let me see that," he demanded. "No," I said. He stepped closer. "You can't just—" "Adam," my mother said sharply. "Don't make this worse." But he was made of stubbornness. He reached anyway, fingers twitching like they belonged to someone else. His hand brushed the edge of the court papers. The air in my chest tightened. My throat felt like sand. I clutched the stack harder. Officer Morales' voice snapped. "Sir, step back." He folded the pages, read a few lines more, and then, "God help me," called his confrater in a low voice to confirm the judge's signature. He tapped on the screen, and in the span of minutes that might have been hours, someone in a courthouse far away confirmed authenticity. The sounds around us, rolling suitcases, a baby's sob, clicks of shoes, faded. The terminal held its breath. "If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people," I muttered absurdly like a talisman. It was automatic now, the mix of ritual and a plea. People laughed quietly. Or maybe it was only my own breath that sounded like laughter. My mother's face went white. For a moment so did Adam's. There was a hardness that softened into something new. Shock, perhaps, or the recognition that the story they had been telling themselves was not as clean as they liked it to be. The stranger who had been sipping coffee dropped his cup. It shattered. The sound struck me like punctuation. It was then that my mother did the thing that had haunted me for years. She looked at me with a vulnerability she never showed and said, "You left," as if that contained everything. There was so much unsaid in those two words. The months of my disappearance that she had damned me for. The evenings I had spent trying to distract myself from the memory of Jonah alone on the porch. But there was also the tremor of a woman who knew she'd been responsible in the worst ways. I looked down at Jonah, then at the papers in my hands, and at the line of people who were suddenly part of our story. The judge's signature glared at me like truth. I had the right to be here, to leave. The officer, having confirmed the authenticity of the documents, nodded to me with a professional pity that hurt. "Ma'am," he said, "for now you may board. Will need to be copied on any filings that follow. If there's a complaint, file it with the station." My brother, who had been poised to dictate the narrative, sank back as if someone had deflated him. The silence in the terminal wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of comprehension. People read the papers and saw, maybe for the first time, that there were things my family had left unsaid about safety and about the cost of secrecy. The airport went silent, then louder in a different way, when I showed the papers that proved the trip was mine. You could see it in the way strangers' faces shifted from idle curiosity to something like real attention, as if the scene on my life had been a television drama they had not realized was nonfiction. I felt naked and vindicated at the same time. There's a peculiar paradox in that. Being seen after years of being invisible can hurt exactly like being punched, and then feel like a miracle. My mother sat down on a plastic bench as if the world had finally become too big for her feet. Adam's jaw worked silently. He was the kind of person who'd always wanted to be believed by others more than he believed himself. "You forged things," he said, suddenly eruptive, trying to reclaim the moral high ground by accusation. "You had no right." "That's enough," Officer Morales said, square and exact. He placed a hand on Adam's shoulder gently but firmly. "Accusations don't hold weight without evidence." My mother had transformed from the composed matriarch into a broken woman with a scarf that no longer made sense. She looked at me like she was measuring my height against a childhood check on a doorframe, less for how tall I was now than for how far I had wandered from whatever she'd planned. "You took him," she whispered. "You left us to clean up. You left a child to be harmed." I shouted, the sound tearing through the terminal. People flinched. A mother too rose down, steadied her toddler, whose mouth fell open. "You knew. You told me to be quiet. You said we'd deal with it without making it worse. You called it." I stopped because my voice was ragged and because calling it by name made certain things real in a way that would not be contained. The papers in my hands were more than a judge's stamp. When I had submitted my packets to Dana, I'd also included photographs. Narrow things the size of proof that no one could write off as exaggeration. A pediatrician's note described bruises. A social worker's report mentioned a child who wouldn't sleep without the light on. The affidavit from the neighbor who'd heard 2 loud footsteps. These weren't theatrical props. They were the detritus of a life in motion when things nearly broke. And then, because the legal maze we were navigating is rarely linear, Dana had done something else. She asked for a notarized recorded statement from Jonah, appropriate for his age, about where he felt safe. She'd gotten it. The child's words, simple, trembling and terrible, had been typed, dated, and included with the custody order. They read, in small blunt sentences, "I don't like it at Grandma's. Miss Mama. I want to stay with Eliza." Parents with an ounce of empathy in them felt something like steel in their throats when they read it. Adam read those words over my shoulder and went pale. He hadn't expected to see the boy's voice, the real voice behind the echo of our family's version. "That's tampered," he muttered, as if changing a piece of paper could change the truth. "No," Dana said before I could. She had arrived, an impossible figure in sensible shoes who wielded a folder like a sword. The court reviewed all of this. Judge Reinhardt did what she always does. She looked at evidence, not allegations. Dana's eyes were fierce. "And the county doesn't hand out custody based on theatrics. There are moments in your life when time rearranges itself. For me, one of those was the second the airline agent asked for my boarding pass, glanced at the custody order, and then returned my ticket with a line of apology that meant more than any of them intended. "You're cleared," she said. "I'm sorry for the confusion." My mother stood slowly, as if the room had become foreign. She wanted something, maybe to touch Jonah, to explain herself, to say that she was sorry. Her voice came thin and small. "Eliza, we love him too. We are family. We are not a family that kept him safe," I said. The words were deliberate, not cruel. I had rehearsed them with Dana, but here they were mine. I loved him enough to leave. Adam's face snapped and he shouted a single name, the name that had long been unspoken, as if it could alter everything. "You left because you wanted to take him away from us. From your own blood. From the situation he would have been in," I corrected. "From the person who touched him. From the house where the curtains hid things." A woman 3 seats over began to cry, quietly. You could hear someone else whisper, "Oh my God." I realized then that the papers had done more than prove my right to a flight. They had exposed a fracture in a polished surface, and people were watching as it split. My mother faltered, then began to speak, and for a terrifying moment her words were incoherent. "I didn't know, we tried. We thought." A litany of excuses wrapped in regret. What came out, though, did not exonerate her. It admitted negligence. It admitted that there had been whispers in the church about boundaries being crossed, and that those whispers had been pushed aside. The terminal listened, a public confessional. For me, the hearing in the airport was as final as any legal victory. It wasn't the judge's stamp that saved us. It was the exposure of what had been hidden. The truth has a way of making rooms tilt. People become statues. Adam looked broken in a kind of righteous way I had never thought I'd see. Like a man who had been rewarded by an unexamined conscience and then discovered it was hollow. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. I heard myself add an out-of-place plea, but one I meant. It was a way to reach across the stretch of the human condition and invite others into the mess, because secrets thrive in silence. When the boarding call finally came and we walked down the jetway, The crowd parted for us as if we carried a story that required passage. People looked at Jonah differently now. Not as a possession, but as a child whose body had been subjected to choice by others. He was quiet. His small hand fit into mine the way a key fits a lock. I felt a fierce protectiveness that made my knees go soft. On the plane, Jonah fell asleep with his head on my lap, and I stared out at the strip lights that stitched the runway into a runway of possibilities. We were not safe, not yet. The legal process promised hearings, more evidence, more people willing to argue and to judge. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like a person with agency in my own story rather than a character in theirs. The weeks after the airport were a blur of paperwork and appointed rooms with beige walls where strangers asked soft questions and scribbled them down. We had hearings that smelled like coffee and nervous perfume, rooms that felt like waiting for weather. My mother and brother filed countersuits, of course, as if conflict alone could transform guilt into righteousness. There were interviews with social workers who smelled like late-night offices and took notes with pens that tapped like metronomes. There was a kind of grief to every form I signed. Every initial made it all the more irrevocable. People asked me how I managed to hold myself together. The truth: I didn't always. There were nights when the old heaviness reasserted itself, when Jonah's soft breathing pulled me from sleep and then thrust me back into memory. There were moments when I found myself hitting replay on the worst scenes like someone learning a choreography they had not chosen. Sometimes on the bus home, I'd cry into my scarf because the city lights seemed to make the world too wide. But there were also moments, thin and bright, where it felt like the universe tilted slightly in my favor. On a rainy afternoon, Dana called me with a kind of news that made my hands shake. The judge had extended the temporary custody order and scheduled a full hearing in 60 days. My throat closed on gratitude that tasted like bile and relief. It didn't mean my mother and brother were suddenly enlightened. It meant that the court recognized evidence and wanted to protect a child while the system did its slow work. My mother sent emails that tried to be conciliatory and then quickly reverted to defensive. Adam, who'd taken to calling me in the dead hours, alternated between pleading and venom. "This ruins everything," he said on one call. "You don't understand what you've done to us." "What's been done to you?" I asked once because I wanted to see his face when he had to define his pain. He couldn't. He stuttered and then hung up. The thing is, some people want the comfort of pain that they can control over the messy work of taking responsibility. The hearings were loud and legal and human, lawyers moving like chess pieces, the judge rapping a gavel like punctuation. My mother testified. She tried to be measured, to say what she thought would keep ties intact. In the end, the court didn't reward sentiment. It rewarded safety. The full hearing reinforced the temporary orders and recommended family counseling to be attended if anyone wanted to see visitation restored in the future. What I hadn't expected was the way reconciliation would feel like both a balm and a wound. When my mother came to visit me in a small, neutral room, our faces were two strangers reading the same book with different covers. She brought a bouquet of daisies, as if brightness could mask neglect. Jonah circled the room, shy and curious, like a small animal testing open ground. "Eliza," she said, taking a breath that made her shoulders tremble. "I am so sorry." Her apology was simple. It had been a long time since I'd heard one that wasn't filtered through power. She cried. The sound was honest and small and hollowed out. "I should have protected you," she said. "I should have believed you." "I don't think you could have known what to do," I answered, because something in me had shifted. The person I had been, hungry for vindication and craving to watch them falter, had softened into someone who understood that we are complicated beings who sometimes fail. That didn't excuse their choices. It didn't stamp their wounds with absolution. But it made me realize that vengeance wouldn't build a life for my son. Healing might. We agreed to attend counseling, both of us, and Adam, with an attitude of grudging compliance, came once and then stopped. He sent an email later, filled with legalese and the old righteousness, but by then I had built a small network of people who believed me. Friends from the hospital, Jonah's therapist, Dana. They were steady like table legs. It's odd what small things feel like salvation, watching Jonah sleep through the night without the twitch of fear behind his eyelids, finding money in my bank account from a coworker who'd read something and wanted to help, the way the sunlight hit the bakery downstairs the first morning we stayed in a place that smelled like safety. There were other revelations I had not expected. When the court allowed limited supervised visits, my mother broke down in front of the social worker and confessed something I had long suspected, that her fear of scandal and being judged by people in church had made her ignore things she should have acted on. "I wanted to keep our family respectable," she said. "I thought that by being quiet we could survive." Her fingers twisted a napkin into threads. I was wrong. Hearing that turned something in me. Rage gave way to a quieter, more dangerous thing. A resolve to not be defined by the secrecy anymore. "I don't want our family secret to be a thing that keeps spreading pain," I told her. "I want Jonah to grow up knowing that truth matters more than keeping faces tidy." The court mandated therapy, but it also opened a different pathway. We began to talk in ways we hadn't. It was awkward at first, two people learning to use words for feeling instead of weapons, but sometimes movement is all the healing has to be, slow and deliberate. Now, months later, if you were to ask me whether the airport silence was a victory, I would say yes and no. It was a victory in the sense that it was a turning point. A moment when the world opened to the idea that a child's safety is more important than the comfort of unexamined narratives. But it was also a wound, because the exposure made public the intimate pain that had lived quietly for so long. We live in a complicated arrangement now. The court scheduled supervised visits. My mother comes once a week and sits with Jonah while a social worker watches over them both. Sometimes it goes well. Other times it's a jagged reminder of how much trust was eroded. Adam is distant but not entirely absent. He sends messages that oscillate between contrition and entitlement. And sometimes in the quiet after a long shift, I cry not because I am weak, but because the sheer effort of building a life out of truth is exhausting and holy. What's changed? I sleep better. I watch the sun pool over the bay from my kitchen and feel less like I'm waiting on someone to call me back into fear. Jonah laughs in his sleep and sometimes calls me Mama in the morning with the certainty of someone who belongs. I teach him to name things. Not just colors and animals, but feelings. It's okay to be afraid, I tell him. It's better to say it out loud. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Truth has a sound. Sometimes it's silent, like a paper being slid across a counter. Sometimes it's loud, like a courtroom. Sometimes it's the small, brave thing of handing a child a piece of bread and choosing their safety over everything else. You can be angry about how you were raised, about the people who chose their reputation over protection, and still decide to let yourself be human. You can ask for help. You can submit documents stamped by judges, yes. But more than that, you can let other people be part of making a future that doesn't repeat the past. I still have days when the old fears press at the edges. Progress isn't linear. But when I think of that moment at the gate, of the hush that fell when a judge's stamp met the fluorescent lights, I realize it was never just about a trip. It was about being seen, about having something in my hands that said, definitively, this is mine to protect. If this story touched you, even a little, don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how it continues. And if you've been through something like this, know that there are people who will read your words and believe you. Leave a comment if you want. I'm reading everything, and sometimes a single sentence from a stranger can feel like a hand on your back. As for me, I am learning to live in the space between what was taken and what we are building. I make coffee at dawn, check Jonah's scraped knee with cool water, and hold the court papers in a box under my bed. Not as proof of some victory, but as a reminder that I chose him when it was hardest, and that choice mattered. The airport went silent the day I showed the papers that proved the trip was mine. The noise that followed was the life I had clawed back, messy and honest and finally, unbearably mine.